Nobody tells you that the worst part happens on a Tuesday. Not the day you land. Not the first night in a strange bed with strange sounds outside the window. The worst part is a random Tuesday, 4 months in, when you realize you've made your coffee, eaten your breakfast, done your grocery list, and swept your kitchen floor without saying a single word out loud to another human being. And you're not upset about it. That's the part that gets you. You're not even upset. You've just gotten used to it. That's the moment nobody warns you about when you're watching those videos about retiring to Mexico. I'm going to tell you what actually happened to me. All of it. The parts that hurt and the parts that saved me. And if you're new to this channel, hit subscribe, because I talk about the real version of this life every week, not the postcard version. My name is Robert Miller. I'm 66 years old. For 38 years, I was an electrician in Dayton, Ohio. I wired houses. I wired warehouses. I climbed into more attics in the middle of July than any sane man should. I was good at it. Steady hands, steady work. A union card I was proud of. I got married at 27 to a woman named Carol, and for a long time that was the whole story. House in Kettering, 2 kids, a garage full of tools that made me feel like I knew what I was doing in a world that mostly didn't ask my opinion about anything else. Then, about 6 years ago, Carol told me she wanted something different, not dramatic. No affair, no big blow-up, just 2 people who had quietly become roommates instead of partners, and one of them finally said so out loud. We divorced in a way lawyers describe as amicable, which is a word that means nobody screamed, not a word that means it didn't hurt. My son lives in Denver now. My daughter's in Charlotte. And I found myself at 63, alone in a house that had 3 empty bedrooms and a garage full of tools I didn't need anymore because there was nothing left to fix. My kids had opinions about the move, and I'll be honest about those too. My son, Mark, was mostly supportive in the practical way engineers tend to be. He wanted spreadsheets. He wanted to know about the healthcare system, the visa process, what would happen if I got sick, and I respected that enough to actually build him the spreadsheet he asked for. My daughter Amy took it harder. She called me the week I told her and asked, flat out, if I was running away from something. I told her the truth, which is that I wasn't running away from anything. I just didn't see the point in staying somewhere out of habit when habit was the only reason left to stay. She didn't love that answer. It took her the better part of a year and 1 visit down here to see it for herself before she stopped bracing every phone call for bad news. I sold the house in Kettering in the spring, and I won't pretend that was simple. I stood in the empty garage on the last day, looked at the outline on the concrete where my workbench had sat for 22 years, and felt something close my throat up that I hadn't expected from a slab of concrete. I want to be honest about why Mexico, because it wasn't romance, and it wasn't a bucket list. It was math, and it was proximity. My brother-in-law, Carol's brother actually, we stayed close even after the divorce, had retired to a town called Ajijic a few years earlier, Lake Chapala area, about 45 minutes south of Guadalajara. He kept sending me pictures, cobblestone streets, mountains wrapped around a lake, and every time we talked on the phone, he'd say the same thing. Bob, you could fly home in half a day if you needed to. That mattered to me more than the weather did. I wasn't trying to disappear to the other side of the planet. I looked at Thailand. I looked at the Philippines. Both looked beautiful, and both felt like a 20-some hour trip away from my kids if something went wrong. Mexico felt like it was still in the same neighborhood, just a neighborhood with better weather and a lake view. I did the math for almost a year before I did anything else. My pension from the electricians union plus Social Security came to a little over $3,900 a month. Comfortable in Ohio, but comfortable the way you white-knuckle through a property tax bill every March. To qualify for a temporary resident visa in Mexico, I needed to show the consulate around $4,400 a month in steady income, or roughly $74,000 sitting in savings for a full year. I had enough saved from selling the house that I could clear that second bar with room to spare, so that's the route I took. I sat at my kitchen table with bank statements spread out like a poker hand, and I remember thinking, this is either the smartest thing I've ever done or the most expensive mistake of my life. There wasn't really a way to know which until I did it. I landed in Guadalajara on a Thursday in March, and my brother-in-law picked me up in a truck that had clearly seen better decades. The drive down to Ajijic took about 45 minutes, and I spent every minute of it with my face basically against the window like a kid. The town sits at over 5,000 feet of elevation, which nobody explains to you clearly enough, because it means the air feels different immediately. Thinner, cooler, and somehow cleaner than anything I remembered from Ohio summers. We came down a hill, and the lake opened up in front of us, this enormous sheet of silver blue water with mountains standing around it like they were guarding it. I actually said out loud, alone in that truck cab, well, I'll be. My brother-in-law just laughed and said, yeah, everybody says something like that the first time. The first few weeks were, if I'm being honest, close to perfect. I rented a small 2-bedroom place near the center of Ajijic for about $850 a month, walking distance to the Malecon, which is the walkway that runs right along the lake. I walked it every single morning. Vendors setting up, old men playing dominoes on a folding table outside a hardware store I made myself go into, just to see what an electrician's supply run looked like in Spanish. I ate street tacos that cost me the peso equivalent of about $1.50 and thought I'd found paradise. My brother-in-law introduced me around. I met a handful of other American retirees at a place called the Lake Chapala Society, which is this old walled compound with a library and a garden that's basically the town square for expats. Everybody was friendly. Everybody shook my hand. And for about 6 weeks, I genuinely thought I had this whole thing figured out. Then the calendar turned, and something started happening that I didn't have a name for at the time. My brother-in-law and his wife left for a 6-week trip to visit her family in Texas, which they did every year. And suddenly the one person who'd been my daily anchor was gone. I still walked the Malecon every morning. I still went to the Lake Chapala Society sometimes. But I noticed I was doing all of it by myself, and worse, I noticed I was fine with that, which should have worried me more than it did. My days took on a shape. Coffee at $6, walk at $7. Errands, whatever they were, stretched out to take as long as possible because they were the only structure I had. Lunch alone. A nap I didn't need. Dinner alone. Usually something simple. Because cooking for one felt like a chore I could never quite justify putting effort into. By 8 at night, I'd sit on my little balcony with a beer and watch the light change over the mountains, and it was beautiful, and I was completely, entirely by myself. There's research on this, and I looked into it after the fact because I wanted to know if what I was feeling had a name. Turns out retirees who move abroad, especially the ones who move without a spouse, are at real risk of what researchers call social loneliness. not necessarily missing one specific person the way you'd miss a wife or a best friend, but missing the broader hum of belonging to something. A neighborhood, a crew, a regular table at a diner where somebody knows your order. I had spent 38 years on job sites surrounded by guys who ribbed me and razzed me and knew my whole life story whether I wanted them to or not. And here I was in the most beautiful place I'd ever lived, and I couldn't have told you a single person who would notice if I didn't show up somewhere for a week. I want to say something plainly here, because a lot of channels won't. I didn't stop loving Mexico during this stretch. That's the confusing part nobody prepares you for. I wasn't miserable in the way you'd expect. I wasn't regretting the decision exactly. I was just quietly, steadily lonely, in a way that didn't announce itself with tears or some dramatic breakdown. It just sat there in the corner of every day, like a piece of furniture I'd stopped noticing, but never actually moved out of the room. If you're watching this and you felt something like that, in Mexico or anywhere else, I want you to know it's not a character flaw. It's just what happens when the scaffolding of a whole life gets removed all at once. I tried the obvious fixes first. There's a happy hour that a lot of the American and Canadian retirees go to on Wednesdays, and I went for a few weeks straight. And here's the honest truth. It helped for about 2 hours a week and did nothing for the other 166. Everybody there was pleasant, but a lot of the conversation was the same loop. Real estate prices, healthcare costs, somebody's story about a bad contractor, comfortable, familiar, and somehow still lonely in a room full of people, because none of it went deeper than surface friendliness. I want you to comment down below if you've ever felt that specific kind of lonely, surrounded by people and still completely alone. I think more of us have felt it than we admit. The moment that really cracked things open for me wasn't happy hour, and it wasn't pretty. About 5 months in, I woke up around 3 a.m. with pain in my lower back so sharp I couldn't stand up straight. The kind of pain that makes a grown man consider crawling to the bathroom instead of walking. My brother-in-law was still out of town. I didn't have a single other number in my phone I felt right calling at 3:00 in the morning, so I did the only thing I could think of. I got myself dressed, one excruciating piece of clothing at a time, and called a taxi to take me to a private clinic near the lake. The driver, a young guy who couldn't have been more than 25, watched me shuffle out to his car bent over like a question mark, and without me saying a word about it, he got out, put a hand under my arm, and walked me the whole way to the passenger seat like I was his own father. Turned out to be a kidney stone, nothing life-threatening, but I sat in that clinic waiting room for 3 hours with nobody in the world who knew where I was. Nobody back in Ohio. Nobody in Mexico. I remember thinking very clearly, if something actually serious happened to me right now, it could be days before anybody even noticed. That thought scared me more than the pain did. I've talked to enough of you in the comments over the months to know I'm not the only one who's had a version of that exact 3 a.m. moment, alone in a country you chose, wondering who exactly you'd call. The thing that actually changed things happened by accident, the way most important things do. There's a small workshop near the Lake Chapala Society where a group of mostly Mexican men fix up donated appliances, fans, small tools, things elderly residents in the area, expat and local both, can't afford to replace. I wandered in one afternoon because I heard the sound of a table saw, and it was the first genuinely familiar sound I'd heard in weeks. A man named Jess, everybody called him Chewy, was elbow deep in the wiring of a broken ceiling fan, cursing at it in Spanish in a way I understood perfectly well, even though I don't speak much of the language. I stood there for a second. Then I just said, "You've got a loose neutral connection, probably right at the switch housing." He looked up at me like I'd spoken in tongues. Then he handed me a screwdriver. We didn't say much that first afternoon. We didn't need to. I fixed the fan in about 12 minutes, and Chewy watched my hands the whole time, the way one tradesman watches another, checking the work, not the words. When I was done, he shook my hand and said, "Otra vez, Mana, come back tomorrow." And I did. I kept coming back. Within a month, I was there 3 mornings a week, elbow deep in donated appliances alongside Chewy and 2 other retired men, one Mexican, one Canadian, none of us sharing more than about 40% of a common language between us, and somehow that didn't matter at all. Work has its own language. A strip screw is a strip screw in every country on earth, and for the first time since I'd landed, I had somewhere I was expected to be, and people who noticed when I wasn't there. What surprised me most wasn't the friendship with Chewy, though that mattered plenty. It was what came after it. Chewy started inviting me to things. Small things at first. A meal after we finished a repair. Then his mother's birthday, where I was handed a plate of food before I'd even finished saying hello, the way you'd feed a nephew who'd shown up late. Chewy's mother, a woman named Doa Rosa, who has to be pushing 85, took one look at me standing awkwardly by her door and said something to her daughter that I later found out translated roughly to, "This one looks hungry. Feed him first, ask questions later." That became something of a family joke, and eventually something of a family truth. I started showing up at Sunday meals. Not every Sunday. I didn't want to overstay a welcome that was never actually withdrawn, but often enough that a chair started to feel like it had my name on it. I started taking Spanish classes at the Lake Chapala Society twice a week, not because I had some grand plan to become fluent, but because I was tired of standing in Chewy's kitchen, understanding maybe a third of what was being said and laughed about around me. My Spanish now is what I'd generously call functional. I can order food, argue about the price of hardware, and tell a joke badly enough that it usually gets a laugh anyway, mostly at my expense. I've learned that the local guys at the workshop have exactly 0 patience for perfect grammar and endless patience for a man who's willing to look foolish trying. That trade felt fair to me. It still does. I also joined a walking group that meets near the Malican 3 mornings a week, a mix of expats and locals who cover a few miles along the lake before the heat sets in. It's not glamorous. Half the conversation is about knee replacements, and the other half is complaining about the price of avocados, which for the record has gone up even here. But I've come to look forward to it the way I used to look forward to the coffee truck showing up on a job site. Small, reliable, human. My brother-in-law came back from Texas eventually, and when he saw how much had changed in 6 weeks, he just shook his head and said, "Bob, you found your people faster than I did, and I've been here 4 years." I told him it wasn't fast. It just didn't look like what either of us expected it to look like going in. None of this erased the parts that are hard, and I want to be straight with you about that, instead of wrapping this up with a bow that isn't honest. I still miss my kids in a way that doesn't get smaller. It just gets more familiar, if that makes sense. I miss Denver in the fall and Charlotte at Christmas. There are still evenings, maybe 1 or 2 a month, where the balcony feels too quiet even now, even with everything I've built here. The bureaucracy of staying legally in this country is real, and my visa renewal last year involved a folder of paperwork thick enough to double as a doorstop, plus a fee that had gone up considerably from what I'd budgeted for. Those things are real, and I won't pretend a good friendship with a handyman erased a single one of them. But here's what I've come to understand, and it took me the better part of 2 years to see it clearly. There are actually two different kinds of lonely, and I'd been treating them like they were the same thing. There's the loneliness of missing specific people, my kids, old friends back in Dayton, a marriage that didn't survive, and that kind doesn't go away just because you build a life somewhere new. It shouldn't go away. Missing people you love is just the tax you pay for having loved them well. But there's a second kind, the loneliness of being invisible, of moving through your days without anyone expecting you anywhere or noticing your absence. And that kind I did fix. Mexico didn't erase the first kind of lonely. What it did was end the second kind completely. And I didn't understand until I was standing in that workshop with grease on my hands that the second kind had been the one quietly wearing me down the whole time. Last month, Doa Rosa's ceiling fan broke again. The original one Chewy and I had fixed the day we met. I went over to look at it, expecting the same loose, neutral connection. It wasn't that. It was just old, worn clean through after years of turning. Chewy and I sat on her porch afterward with coffee, watching the afternoon light do the thing it does over that lake, gold, then pink, then that deep blue that shows up right before the streetlights come on. Doa Rosa came out and put a hand on my shoulder, the way she does now without even thinking about it, and said, in Spanish I understood every word of this time, "You're not a guest here anymore, Roberto. You're family that took the long way getting here." I didn't have anything to say back to that. I just nodded and drank my coffee and let the lake do the talking for a while. I'm Robert Miller. Thank you for listening to Retired in Mexico.